Abundance, the gate of spirit. It is the potential to be clear of where provocation is and not, and whether one likes it or not. It's something to consider about the nature of the 55th gate, that this gate of spirit is where the spirit will awaken, but of course it's layered by the emotional wave that gives this gate its deep, deep quality of moodiness and melancholy. Melancholy is to be understood as a wave that is relatively consistent and then goes straight up or straight down. Like the pulse itself of the individual process. In other words, sometimes when you meet 3955s and you assume that they are incredibly emotional people, you can find that you can be with them for a very long time and they seem to be very, very cool and stable in their emotional field. Because this is the nature of the melancholic chemistry in them. In other words, that they don't really jump into the extremes of the wave in a long process, but it's something that happens and is triggered at a specific moment. And they either go up or go down. That is very different from the tribal wave, which is a very, very long wave. And it's different from the experiential wave, which is a very tight cyclical wave. So we come to this 55th gate, and in terms of sexuality, the 55th gate is a gate of being fickle. Fickle. The fickle finger of fate. I left out another F, but I'm being a good boy today. The 39 at the other end is the gate of teasing. You can see they're made for each other. The 39 teases and the 55 is fickle. The 55, because it is the gate of melancholy, that there is only one salvation for the people who carry this gate, and that is no reasons. No reasons. Don't give a reason to your melancholy. Don't attach it to somebody else. It's so important. This 55th gate is where the emotional spirit is going to awaken. We're going to have these children that are going to come into the world starting in 2027. And they're going to carry the potential of the spirit underneath this melancholic motor wave. And of course, that doesn't mean that they're going to have easy access to the spirit unless they can deal with the melancholy. And it also says something very profound. It says that this awakening of the emotional spirit will be deeply creative, mutative. Above the line it says, abundance is strictly a question of spirit. And you know, I describe this cup as this gate as the cup that is half full, and you wake up in the morning and you say it's half empty, or you wake up the next day and you say it's half full. It's the same cup. And it's so important for the 55 to recognize that its emotional up and its emotional down, that its melancholic sadness and happiness are measurements by which they can be clear, are the parameters for their clarity and productivity in the world. Only when the 55 is melancholically sad is it truly fickle. And it's that moment of sadness where they're ready to say, the fickleness leads to reason, where they're ready to say, I'm sad because, is the moment they lose the creative potential of that sadness. Melancholy is the only source of art. It doesn't come from any place else. I'm not talking about talent, pure creativity. out of melancholy. It's one of the great challenges to be able to accept either the emotional wave or the melancholic chemistry or the two of them together, and to accept them by not establishing reasons. Now, anybody that can do that is going to be a very special human being. I mean, it's so easy for me to say such things, to live such things. It's so extraordinary, because it requires a deep, deep recognition of the logic of the process, so that one can accept the nature of the motor, the way that it works. First line is cooperation. It says, Jupiter exalted the expansion of activity through cooperation with powerful forces through principled actions that guaranteed continued support and engender prosperity. That is the potential to find the spirit through cooperation with powerful forces. The powerful forces are always going to be the 39 at the other end. In other words, to be able to cooperate with a provocative force means you found the right force. This is a gate of music, because it is in this host stream. And most of all, it is a gate of sound, of tone, and is acoustic. If you want to keep a moody person happy, don't raise your voice. Because they will react to the tone, even if they're wrong in what's going on. So it's very acoustic. This cooperation is essential. Remember that the emotional spirit that awakens brings us an integrated awareness. In other words, this is desperately in need of social gifts. It leads, after all, to the 22nd gate of grace, that is the individual gateway to the social world. Venus in detriment, the concentration on harmonic relationships with powerful forces that provide for continuity but not necessarily advancement. That is the potential to harmonize with powerful forces but not necessarily for the benefit of the spirit. And you'll notice that here in the very foundation, in the line of introspection, this deep concern for dealing with the other already. Now, this is the heart of the freak spirit. At the heart of the freak spirit is, I'm different. I want to be left in peace. I better leave everybody else in peace. This way to try to find a way to cooperate with other forces. It's right there at the very beginning of discovering the spirit. And it also indicates that the emotional spirit is absolutely dependent on the other. Now, obviously, given that we live in a time where people are not aware and are operating exclusively in the emotional wave and being distorted by it, that these cooperations are not necessarily successful. The second line, distrust. You have someone who by their very nature, 55th gate, is emotionally fickle. That is, emotionally, they don't know whether the cup is half empty or half full because they're always going back and forth. But when they're doing that in their own environment and somebody looks in the window, it can create suspicion. Other people are suspicious of 55-2s. In some cases, afraid of them. Because, of course, when you knock on their door, you don't know what you're going to get. You don't know whether you're going to get the melancholy and the down emotional system at full blast, or vice versa. Abundance hampered by slander and gossip. The gift of being able to penetrate to the center that may demonstrate effectively through its relating talents that its truthfulness is genuine. That is, emotional stability and the strength of the spirit is dependent on being trusted by others. And of course, the difficulty for the 55-2 is that it can't be trusted by others until it can cooperate. And it can't cooperate with everyone. That's about how you enter into the relationship. That's about you being aware of your nature, your definition, your type, your authority, to guide you. The earth in detriment, you'll notice here with the earth in detriment that this is going to be in a theme in Incarnating Crosses. The direct challenge to the slanderers, who will always have the advantage of quoting the bard, Shakespeare, methinks he doth protest too much. Only continued example can overcome distrust. I told you the secret. No reasons. And the moment that 55-2 starts making up excuses about why they're this or why they're that or why they know or why they're right, it makes it worse. It just makes it worse. You know, you'll notice the proviso, only continued example. Go back into your own space, not distracted, and live your example. Don't get caught up in what other people say. So much of that is about not being aware emotionally, of taking people in at the high end of your wave, which is a hustle, because you take them in and you lead them on, in a sense, as to the nature of what you really are, and that the next time that they have to deal with you, they're going to have to deal with a different being, and that can be very confusing. When it comes to finding the spirit, the 55 can be just as provocative as the 39. I mean, this is deeply provocative because it's deeply mutative. When I had my experience with the voice, the 3955 was present as transit. The third line of Innocence. I like this line. It's the Nuremberg trial line. Here, I was only following orders is a genuine defense. Saturn exalted, when the form is correct and attempts at actualization have been disciplined and within guidelines, failure cannot be personally attributed. That is the emotional potential to recognize that despite one's best efforts, failure is possible and does not need to affect the spirit. And this is so important. This is part of the underlying spirit of all third lines. You know, that if you're correct going in, then it doesn't matter how it turns out. It is not going to destroy your spirit. And this is so important. This is about accepting yourself. Remember, the spirit of humanity is here in this gate. Accept yourself. Each of these lines carry with it deep, deep, deep messages about what is required of humanity in mutation. It's not about whether you win or lose. It's how you play the game. That's this line. And it's very important because that's what it's all about. That's what life is all about. It's not whether your life is a success or not. It's whether it's your life. The detriment, where the struggle against conformity or individual initiative can bring a superior to ruin while safely hiding behind his shield. Goodness. The energy to selflessly protect one's spirit at the expense of others. I entered into this properly. I'm not responsible for this being a mess. They are. 55s can be provocative. They are. I came in this properly. They made the mess. Imagine if that's just guided by emotions. You know, the Spirit's here. Underneath all of this emotional chaos on the surface, there's a Spirit here, and we're very, very, very close to its cusp of awakening. We're very close. These 29 years don't mean anything in global time. They're nothing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this knowledge now. It's very close. The fourth line. It is interesting that this is one of the exalted positions for the transpersonal in an individual gate. In other words, here when you're looking at this entire stream of emoting, that of course it leads to and it fuels the 1222, which is the only social channel of the individual. So it's very important to see that the social capacity from the very beginning in this gate, from line 1, this need for cooperation, by the time you get to the upper trigram and the transpersonal, that you have very powerful emotional force. You'll notice the inherent harmony between the first and fourth line. That the first line is cooperation and the fourth line is assimilation. Jupiter exalted the establishment of a framework that balances principles with energy and leads inevitably to expansion and prosperity. That is a potential spirit that comes when emotional awareness and energy are balanced and principled. Yeah. Well, when emotional energy is balanced and principled, I'll be long dead. This is quite an ordeal. And of course, it is the whole theme for the 55-4. And remember what the fourth line is all about. It is about friendship. It is about finding a way to work with your energy, to work with your emotional system with others, to find the right spirit, to find prosperity, well-being. You know, we put so much emphasis on the splenic center as a health center that we forget that you can be emotionally ill through the solar plex system. And that there is real illness potential in the solar plex system and its nervousness. And that only when you're behaving according to your nature, only when you're responding to the nature of the world through your design, your type, your definition, are you going to be able to let go and release emotions that are not detrimental. Remember, for me, there is nothing in the emotional field that should ever be restrained, ever. It's not about that. It's about the emotional beings being clear in the release of that energy, and that's what this is all about. Mars in detriment, boundless energy that knows no restraint, boundless energy that ignores awareness at the risk of the spirit. It's always because of the other. The emotional system dominates our sexuality, dominates our bonding, dominates our pleasure system, dominates all these things, and it's never been aware. And the spirit of humanity is rooted in being able to connect with the other in a way that transcends individual awareness. Everything about the success of the spirit is determined by the success of that being to recognize and be clear about the nature of the other, itself and the other. Because it requires a cooperation, a melding, if you will, that is hard for us to imagine at the emotional level is even possible. In the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of this fourth line, we have the juxtaposition cross, and the 2034 is replaced with the 16 and the 9. So that we have the 55, 59, 9, and 16. This is the juxtaposition cross of moods. And of course, these are going to be very, very moody beings. They're there to assimilate. So it's their process always to try to find the right person. Now look, I give you a very, very clear, easy way for individuals to know whether the person that they're with is going to be okay for them. It's called listen to their music. You know, if you're a 55 and you really want to know about the spirit of the other in relationship to you, all you got to do is hear their music. You know, they put on their tape in the car where they give you the first ride that you take with them and they slip a tape on. If you don't like what you hear, you're not going to like them. They're going to be lousy lovers, lousy friends, lousy partners, all of that. And why waste your spirit? There is no survival for the individuality and no peace in the life without the acceptance of melancholy. None. And if you are an emotional melancholic, then the pressure on you is so much that you must get out of the reason game, or you really get burnt up in your spirit. The left angle cross is the cross of spirit. It is in this cross, obviously, that the mutation will take place when we get to the 6th line. In the 5th line, the line of universalization, we have the line of growth, the unusual ability in a position of power, again the assumption of power, it may or may not come, to accept advice and transform it innovatively. This gift in a position of power allows one to continue to lead rather than being perceived as being led. The emotional strength and spirit derive from positions of power. In other words, it's essential for the 55 to learn how to cooperate. It's essential. And it's essential for the 5th line to be projected on as the one that can bring the spirit necessary. After all, that's part of its gift. So when it's in power, when it is projected on, even though it doesn't guide anything because it's being cooperative, it gets to keep its power and its identity. Which, of course, being individual is very important. But it gives you a hint about the depth of the mutation that has to come. Is that the individual has to be ready to give up for awareness their individuality. The sun in detriment. An integrative openness that in its broad acceptance of advice may be eventually eclipsed. Here it is. Here it is. In the detriment, you get the taste of what has to come. And it's the most mystical of detriments in that sense. An emotional openness where the spirit is at risk from conditioning. Yes. It's not talking about the being. It's talking about the spirit. And here's the possibility where the individual can allow its spirit to blend with another. Now, of course, on the mundane plane, that's not at all what that looks like. That looks like somebody being overwhelmed emotionally. And then you get to the 6th line. Remember that in the precession of the equinox, that this is moving backwards through the wheel, that is, clockwise through the wheel. And right now we're in the 37th hexagram, 1st line as a theme. And in 2027 we go backwards to and enter into the 55th hexagram, 6th line. In other words, in 2027, the precession of the equinox is always moving backwards from the lines. It's always starting from the roof and going to the basement instead of the other way around. So when we reach that point, what we're going to get to is this 55-6, and it's here that the mutation takes place. And it's called selfishness. Saturn exalted. It's such a funny line. Acquisition obsession, that though alienating is still indirectly beneficially, materially to others. Can I take you to the weird stuff right underneath this line? You look at this line very, very carefully, because inside of this line, remember that the Black Book is poetry. There's a lot of things in here that are just waiting for you to have all the pieces in the puzzle in order to be able to open them up. Acquisition obsession. Now, one of the things that's involved here is the spirit and its need to cooperate and its need to meet other spirits. That's underneath. That though alienating, it will alienate everybody else at the surface level, because they're seeking the spirit underneath, and only the spirit underneath. But is still indirectly beneficial materially to others, because the byproduct of that will be a new level of awareness. Now that's all the mystical blah 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 that's underneath. It's the potential of finding the spirit through materialism. Now what I tell 55-6s to prepare them for the spirit is to love shopping. You know, to enjoy the benefits of money. Remember that this spirit, I don't want to disappoint anybody, is form. And that the spirit that will awaken will operate on a form principle. Oh, it's as material as they get, but it's like buying the best material. The moon in detriment, where the material abundance exists, but no one gets to share in its light. The no moon phase. Now mystically, the difference between the exalted and the detriment is the exalteds will get the mutation and the detriments won't. Now that isn't because the detriment is bad. Please. That is that the genetic mutation will awaken in them, but it will be non-transferable in the sense that they will not be able to participate in the interaction of the waves, but will be able to pass on the capacity to their offspring, if they have any. If they have any. Because at the same time that the 55-6 mutates its opposition, the 59-6 mutates. In other words, our sexual strategies are going to mutate. And in the detriment, you will have fertility that is there, but not transferable. In other words, the potential is there, but the possibility of manifesting it is impossible. So even when we get to a point where we start looking for, test-wise, those people that are fertile, we're still going to have a problem getting them to actually be fertile at that point. So please understand that the capacity to participate in the mutation will be there, but only as a transfer of the genetic material, not as a generation that in its own matrix will actually be able to experience the spirit through those waves. I'm giving you the mutative quality of all of this, but please recognize that for the next 27 years, and for long afterwards, those people that have been carrying all of this emotional 55, you know, it still operates on a very mundane plane. It operates under the guise of all 6 lines, in which the spirit does not seem to be possible to express because there aren't forces that can properly cooperate that really allow the spirit to shine. And the 55-6 crawls up onto its hill and says, you know, the only spirit that I can find is if I have enough to eat and there's enough to, you know, I can go to the movies and whatever the case may be, but not really in being able to meet in others the soul mate. Remember, this is the opposite of the 59-6. You know, the 55-6 is looking for its spirit soulmate. It's looking for the ability to reveal itself and become one with the other. But of course, that isn't exactly easy given the nature of the emotional motor and the lack of spirit in our own time. And of course, for that, you have a lot of people who are the 55-6s who are really sitting up there and saying, there is nobody to embrace my spirit, and I will wait until that possibility exists. They will be very good at recognizing the children when they come. You know, they'll know there's something different about them. And of course, it will also mean that, you know, at the moment that that is possible, we will see that the nature of these lines and how they're interpreted will change, because they will open up to a different possibility. At this moment of mutation, you know, at the moment that you have the genetic mutation that is going to change awareness, where do you go? You go to the family, baby. You go right into the tribe. You bring it right into the basic structure of the family, and you bring it into the genetic pool of the children of the family. That's the pathway of that mutation. And what that says is that in the awakening of the spirit, which will change the way the emotional system operates, that the spirit awareness will first move through the individual process and then be transferred to the tribe. It will never reach the abstract collective. It will never be part of the human experience, because these babies ain't quite human in that sense. In other words, it's not part of the human experience that has brought us to this point. After all, these children who are going to be born with this, they're not going to have an enormous amount of time on Earth. They might get to have a millennium and a couple of 100 years tacked on, but that's not really a long time compared to our 4 million year Homo movement.